De Havilland's Vampire night fighter was not one of history's great aircraft. It started out as a private venture that led to an order from Egypt. But deteriorating relations between Britain and that country resulted in the aircraft being taken on by the RAF. In that service, it covered a brief gap in all weather air defence coverage caused by delays first to the Gloucester Javelin and then to the Meteor night fighter that was intended to be its interim. The Vampire night fighter had just enough performance to deal with a Tu 4 Bull, but not much margin for error. Now, in parallel to the development of the Vampire night fighter, de Havilland was working on the thin wing, ghost powered Vampire FB 8, which would see production as the Venom. The Venom was nearly 100 miles an hour faster than the Vampire. It could climb faster than a Sabre, and despite the fact that its wings featured only a 17-degree leading edge sweep, it could outturn that fighter above 35,000 feet. Wingtip tanks also increased mission duration, important for a patrol and interceptor fighter. Ever entrepreneurial, de Havilland decided to privately develop a night fighter version of the Venom to market to export customers who couldn't afford to operate something as advanced as the proposed F-86K all-weather Sabre. De Havilland started with the single-seat Venom, retaining the wings, tail booms, and engine installation, but redesigning the fuselage pod so that it could accommodate a radar operator in a side-by-side layout. Without the automation present in a contemporary US fighter, the second crewman was essential to execute an interception in poor visibility. Like the Vampire night fighter before it, the Venom cockpit was based on the Mosquito, the successful night fighter versions of which had been flying since the early 1940s. The radar operator thus sat to the right and slightly to the rear of the pilot, with the radar equipment in front of him. This arrangement was considered relatively spacious, though in reality cramped compared to any contemporary besides the legendarily spelt Starfire. It was seen as a very social arrangement for the two crewmen as well. Unlike the Vampire, the Venom featured the World War II era Air Intercept Mark 10 radar. The radar could pick up a bomber-sized target at about 10 miles and a fighter at 5. Even in 1950, this was poor by Western standards, but it was quick to install, well understood by crews and maintainers as well. The final point to say for an export aircraft is that the technology was largely obsolete, so there wasn't any real risk in technology transfer. Thus equipped, the first prototype took to the air in August 1950 as the Venom NF2. Like the single-seat Venom, the initial prototype suffered with poor roll performance and heavy controls at higher Mach numbers. It also had a propensity to drop a wing at the onset of a stall, a problem caused by the wing tips stalling before the roots. A new and novel problem, testing uncovered, was that asymmetric airflow around the new nose caused the fighter to go out of trim at higher speeds, reducing its effectiveness as a weapons platform. This was caused by a somewhat strange design feature. The side glass panel on the pilot's cockpit was flat, whereas the radar operator's was larger and curved to provide better visibility. Making the canopy symmetric solved the problem. These were the early days of transonic aerodynamics, and aircraft designers were not used to the unforgiving nature of airflow at these speeds. Even so, the RAF immediately showed an interest in the new fighter, having been rather uninterested hitherto. Although an elegant, stable aircraft, the Meteor night fighter was not the most high performance of aircraft, particularly at high altitudes. Its effectiveness against a Bison was marginal. The Venom had better underlying performance. With more powerful control actuation, the majority of the stability issues were resolved, and the Venom NF2 was ready for service. It was a 630-mile-an-hour fighter that could climb to a ceiling of 50,000 feet at an initial climb rate of over 8,700 feet per minute. Patrol range was up to 1,000 miles. Interception radius was more like 300 to 350. The first production Venom NF2 came off the line in March 1952, but was almost immediately lost in a crash. Others followed it off the line, though. One of these early production examples was actually evaluated by NATO to see if it should be their recommended night fighter, but it was decided that there were better options available. Only one squadron was equipped with the original NF2, 23 Squadron at Coltishall. Squadron strength in those days was 16 aircraft, the first of which was received in late 1953. Unfortunately, the first months of its service were a disaster. A number of unexplained crashes led to the type being restricted to 10,000 feet altitude. Obviously, this was useless for an all-weather interceptor. Cracks were eventually discovered in several aircraft's wheel wells. Local strengthening modifications were made and the restrictions were lifted in the late summer of 1954. Once free of those restrictions, the Venom was able to demonstrate its superior performance. It was a faster climber than the Meteor NF-11 and could outturn it at high altitude while also carrying a more effective armament. The Venom's quad 20mm cannon battery was nose-mounted, improving accuracy and also reducing the tendency for feed-related jams that blighted the Meteor night fighter's wing-mounted installation. Partway through production, an improved frameless canopy and new fins sourced from the Vampire T-11 were fitted. The new canopy was important as the previous arrangement made it hard for pilots to position the aircraft on approach at night. This NF-2A model was issued to 253 Squadron at Waterbeach in April 1955, then to 219 and 33 Squadron at Driffield. These were the only three squadrons to operate the 2A, and all three were disbanded in August 1957. A total of 90 NF2s and 2As were produced. So the Venom NF2 was in essence a flying prototype, created at the RAF's expense. Crews regarded it as rather dubious, but it had potential and de Havilland quickly began work on an improved version. The NF3 featured a more powerful 4,950 pound-force Ghost 104 engine, powered controls, and an adjusted outer tailplane. The bullet fairings at the intersection of the tailplane and fin were moved from the leading to the trailing edge to reduce tail buffeting at transonic speeds. Also important was the fitment of the Air Intercept Mark 21 radar. This was a British version of the American APS-57, modified with a British strobe unit and a variable pulse function. This significantly improved detection range to up to 25 miles for bombers and 15 to 20 miles for fighter-sized targets. It also had a useful air-to-surface mode that made finding airfields at night that much easier. Overall, APS-57 had more operating modes than AI Mark 10, better definition, a limited lock-follow facility, and IFF and navigation beacon functions. Its grey Perspex radome is a distinguishing feature versus the NF2. The aircraft is also somewhat longer because of its fitment. Once again, there were no ejection seats fitted, though. Someone really didn't like the RAF's night fighter crews. Developed relatively rapidly, NF3 began replacing the early AI-10 equipped Meteors and Venom NF2s from June 1955. Oddly, this is about the same time that the first generation Gloucester Javelins were beginning to enter service. Most NF3s ended up being replaced by Javelins in 1958, with one squadron soldiering on as long as 1961. Sweden bought 62 NF2s in 1952, all of which were ultimately upgraded to NF3 standard. Known as the J-33 in Swedish service, they were replaced with Lansons in 1960. But although short-lived in service with both air forces, the Venom night fighter squadrons were constantly busy in their life. The two squadrons at Coltishall devoted alternate weeks to day and night flying, enabling them to maintain round-the-clock proficiency without undue strain being put on air crews and ground crews. In wartime, their mission would be to intercept bombers coming down over the North Sea to attack London and the South East. A typical day's work might include half a dozen sorties on one or more of a variety of missions: cross-country flying, air-to-air gunnery with the station's Meteor 8 target tug, formation flying, instrument flying, GCA letdowns, and ground control interceptions. Usually that would be one Venom on another. My understanding is that the Venom crews on day shift were predominantly there for training purposes. Hunters and other day fighters were the primary interceptor force in clear air. In the afternoon, early or late, depending on the time of year, the duty night squadron flight tested its Venoms in preparation for the night's work. The night, again, was spent mainly on GCI, with Venoms working as pairs. Bomex exercises, in which Canberras usually comprised the attacking force, were also frequent. For example, on the night of Thursday, December the 8th, a hostile force of more than 70 Canberras on their way to bomb Weymouth was intercepted by East Coast night fighter squadrons, including number 141. Those who have been to Weymouth might think that nuking it would have been the best option. During these exercises, the best picture of the battle as a whole was at Sector HQ, where every component of the defence system was coordinated, from the coastal radar stations to the aircraft at readiness at each of a number of night fighter airfields. Early warning was provided by the Rotor radar stations, which at this stage consisted of 54 sites using mainly World War II era radars. Night shift crew in the ready room had to be prepared to get aircraft into the air at a moment's notice by means of a telescramble, a pleasantly archaic way of describing a telephone call. They would then run to their aircraft, use the cartridge start, apply full power without a warm-up, and go straight off on a GCI. Venom's improved speed and climb rate meant that it was able to meet attackers further out from land than Meteor or Vampire. This was critical as the densely packed UK mainland offered little option for defenders to trade distance for time to effect an intercept. The likely attacking force in this period would have been Tu-4 Bulls and IL-28 Beagles in the first part of its service. Bisons, Bears and Badgers could hypothetically have joined them during the second half of the 1950s, but only the latter was actually available in sufficient numbers to launch a serious raid, and its performance would have been a major challenge to the Venom. The main reason, however, for the relatively brief service life of the jet was conservative RAF air safety policy. A standing presumption in favour of twin-engined aircraft dictated that Venoms were replaced by Javelins even before the older Meteors were, despite the fact that the mature Venom actually had an excellent safety record. That did not, however, stop the Fleet Air Arm adopting a modified version of the type as the Sea Venom. So that's it for the Venom Night Fighter, an interesting and well-designed little plane that performed an important strategic role, if only for a few years.